So, welcome back to another Wednesday class. Today we're going over rook and pawn endings. The first position we'll be looking at is the Lucina position. So, very critical position that we need to know in order to know how to finish things off. So we've got the white pieces here, and our goal is to win with our extra pawn, of course. As we go through today, we'll look at drawing methods, we'll look at winning methods, we'll look at exceptions to the rules that we talk about, and there's lots of different, very specific things when it comes to rook and pawn endings. So hopefully this won't flood your mind too much, and hopefully you'll be able to go back and review it later and see all of those different exceptions, because for pretty much every rule, there's a time where that rule doesn't work. So we'll look through all of those things here today. So this is the Lucina position. A couple of you may have seen this before. Black is trying to stop you from making a queen by, of course, attacking your pawn, not letting the king run away from it. And if the king comes out to the side, he's going to try to check you all day long. That's what he wants to do. So how do we find a way to make progress, get out of the checks, and queen this pawn? What is the strategy here? What do you think, Bobby?
I think it's like rook to f5, so then we can pop our king out and then start moving our king, and then once the rook checks us when our king's on e6 and the rook checks us, and we can block with our rook.
So rook f5 is the right idea. Like you said, you're trying to bring your king out and use your rook to block the checks. However, rook f5 is not quite the right square. What are you going to play after king g6? Attacking your rook.
Rook to d5?
Rook to d5, then king to f6.
Oh, yeah. Not good.
So rook to f5 isn't quite the right square, but it is the right idea. Do you remember what it is?
Well,
there's two ways of doing it, really.
Real quick, just make sure I'm not missing something. So, what happens after rook g1 check?
So rook g1 check is one of the ways you can go about continuing for the win. It's important that we know the follow-up as well to it. So first, let's say that black goes king h7. What would we do here?
Well, I assume it would be the same kind of thing as I moved before.
Same sort of concept.
Anyway, the line I was looking at was king f6 instead, then king f8, and then black loses a rook.
Yes, so there is a tactical idea there. If black plays king f6, then you can go king f8, because if he takes, check, king over, check, and white wins the rook in the game. So black has to go to the h file. And the question is, how do we finish it off then? We've driven black's king away from the pawn, and how can we build that bridge is how we like to call it when we talk about the Lucina position. Ryan?
I think it's just maybe a rook g5 with the same idea.
So rook g5 is the same sort of thing that Bobby was talking about, but it's too close because the king is going to attack the rook.
Rook to g4.
Rook to g4. So the point is we're going to put our rook 5 ranks away from the queen square. So in this case it's the 4th rank, sometimes we call it the 5th, but 5 away from where the pawn is going. And how is this going to work for us? Well, let's go ahead and see. Let's say black plays a waiting move like rook e1. What should we do next?
King to d7.
King d7, black checks.
King to e6.
King e6.
Black checks.
King to d6.
Black checks.
King to e5.
And then king to e5, black checks.
Rook to e4.
And now we've built that bridge. So the pawn's not going to be able to queen, or the pawn will be able to queen. Black can't stop it. His king is too far away.
Oh, that's why you do check first.
That's why you do check first. So the key is two things to this position. The first is that you have to drive black's king one further rank away, because if the black king is here, then he'll be able to play the move king to f7 after you trade the rooks at the end of everything. Also, you could start with the move rook to f4 here. Either way works. You could play rook g1 or rook f4 first after rook e2. But once again, you have to make sure you drive the king away. So after king g8, then you would have to play rook g4, and then you have the same thing. So either way will work, but you have to make sure you do both of those ideas.
So what if the rook goes after rook to g1?
Which line are you looking at?
Rook to G1 first.
Rook to G1 for the first move. Okay. So Rook G1.
When king moves to H7, and then rook goes to G4. What if black goes rook to D2?
Rook to D2.
Oh, king just goes to that.
Yep. We just come out the other side because we've got two ways that we can go out. Looks like you answered that one yourself. Alrighty. Any questions on the Lucina position before we go to the next one? Yes.
I seem to remember something about when black wants to draw, he needs to check from the long side. Is that a Philidor thing? Forget.
That's not the Philidor, but we will be talking about that later. So similar to the Lucina, but it's a different position, and that'll be coming up a couple slides on. So next is Philidor, and then we'll get to the short side, long side. But good question. So this is going to lead to a Philidor position. We have black to play here. White has just made the wrong move, rook to A7. And what can black do to draw this position? Does anybody know what the Philidor technique is here? Dom?
Rook b6.
Rook b6. Why do you play that? What's the idea?
Keep the king off the sixth rank. Six.
Okay, so we keep the king off the sixth rank, but what if white pushes the pawn forward?
Rook b1 and start checking from behind.
Exactly. So now we get as far away from the king as possible. Once the pawn is forward, white is not going to have any shelter to hide in front of the pawn anymore, and we'll be able to check all day from the back rank. So if white tries to come forward, we just check and we dance wherever we want to go. If he comes over here, what's the easiest way to keep the draw?
Rook e1.
Just attack the pawn again and force it back to it, rather than keep checking the king, and you might get yourself in trouble if you're not paying attention, but just keep checking. So that's the main idea for the Philidor. Now in the Philidor position, you're just going to have your king directly in front of the pawn. That's the easiest place to make sure that that opponent's pawn doesn't end up queening. And then place your rook on the sixth. And like we said, white can't ever push this pawn, or we go to the backside and check. And if white checks us back here, we'll just step back and forth between e7 and e8 all day. And there's not really any other ideas for white to try to push forward. Any questions on that one?
So at the beginning, what should white have played instead?
Yeah, so in
Did
this
rook get-
position, he played rook a7 and that lost, and we'll actually look at that. I think the next position, or one of the next two, yeah, is basically the same idea. So let's look at that here. This is essentially the same position, but white to move, right? If it's black's move, he's going to play the move rook to b6 and achieve a Philidor. However, it's white to move here. So how can white take advantage of this position and show that the Philidor is not going to work just yet? Bob?
White may try to do rook a6 to prevent black from doing rook to b6.
So rook a6 would prevent the move rook to b6, but it's not going to stop black from just stepping his king up.
Okay.
And then he's still stopping your king from coming forward that way. There's another idea here, and it all has to do with timing. These rook endings are very timing specific, very time sensitive, based on when we make a move and where the rooks may or may not be. So what's black's defensive idea with the Philidor? Right.
Rook b6, and if the pawn pushes, check all. Go to the back rank and check all day.
Right, so the point is once the pawn pushes and our rook's on b6, then the pawn's already too far forward and we can check from the backside all day. However, can black check from the backside yet? No, so we have a way to take advantage of the timing here in this position.
King move. King to e6.
So if you play king to e6, then black plays rook b6,
Oh.
and once your king goes back, it'll be a Philidor. So not quite, but very close to the right solution.
I'm sick.
king to f6.
Ah.
First of all, why does e6 not work? Why is this bad?
It leads to the Philidor position.
It leads to the same concept, right? He'll play rook b1 and check you from behind all day. So what's the idea behind king to f6?
If he plays rook b6, then you play e6.
Exactly. If rook b6 here, now we can play e6, and the rook is not behind us, so he can't give these checks yet. He's one move away, and we're threatening checkmate, so that's not going to work out for him. So he doesn't want to play check right away. Let's say he plays rook to b1. How should we follow this up now?
King to e6? No, just rook.
So
No,
if
rook
king
goes
beat
to
e6, rook b6, and we're back in a Philidor.
Wait.
Remember our very first position when we looked at the Lucina? That's our goal. So we want to see if we can figure out a way to create the Lucina position.
Rook to a.
I was thinking rook to a8.
Rook to a8. So first we're going to drive this king out of the square, and eventually we want our own king to be there with our pawn up here, right? We want to create that Lucina position. So king comes to d7. Yes. e6. All right, king to d6. James.
What about rook d7 check?
Rook to which square?
To d7.
d8.
Oh yeah, d8.
Okay. Rook d8 check, driving the king away, so king c7.
And then rook to d7.
Oh, there's better than rook to d7 here. Rook d7 will still win, because you've got the king away. You can still achieve a Lucina position. But what's a little bit faster even?
e7.
e7. And the point is the pawn defends the rook, and you're threatening the queen where the queen and the rook defend each other. So if black checks you, what should you do here? Which way are you going to go? To the e file or the g file?
I would go to the g file.
To the g file, and we'll just run him out of checks this way, and eventually we'll make our queen. So that's the whole idea. To answer your question from before, in that position where when white played rook a7, what should he have done instead? He should have played the move king f6 in that other position that we saw. The idea is that you leave the option to shield your king from the check on b6 with the pawn, and then threaten the mates. And then if the rook goes back, the point is with your king on f6, you've got two different ways to get out of checks by either pushing the pawn or coming to the side, and you've got the ability to infiltrate by pushing the king off of the 8th rank. So all really timing ideas here, right? Very one move apart on everything. The positions of our rooks and whose move it is matter a whole lot in these endings. Any questions on that one? Okay. Now we're going to talk about the concept of the short side and the long side. So again, we've got the black pieces, and unfortunately we're not able to set up a Philidor position at the moment. Our rook's here on b1. If we could play a move like rook to a1, that would be really nice. It would drive the king back, and then we could get the Philidor. But our rook is on b8 instead, so we can't play rook to b6. So instead, we're going to have to use a different concept to try to hold the draw. Now, we know that if white can achieve the Lucina position, that that'll be winning. So we don't want white to be able to play check, force our king out, and do like he did in the last example, right? But there's another way that we can hold this draw. So first of all, this move is a pretty hard one to find. The very first move is maybe the most critical one. Does anybody know how to start this position off to set up the idea of the short side defense?
Rook to a1?
Rook to where?
A1?
A1 over here. That's not quite gonna work. I believe I can play check on H8.
Ooh.
Then your king's gonna come out, and it's gonna look just like our last example. So we can't let this rook H8 check drive us away so easily unless we're able to stop that pawn from advancing.
So I need to stop that pawn from
James.
What about rook to d1?
Rook to d1, this is the move. And the idea here is if white checks, then after king e7, you can't push this pawn because the rook is helping to defend that square here. So let's say that white decides to take another route here and plays king to d6, threatening checkmate. Now what should we do?
Not rook
What about rook to king to e8?
So king to e8 is the right idea, but the wrong way. So here's where
King to f8.
that concept of the short side comes into play. So the point of this position is we want our king to escape to the side where there's fewer squares on the side of the pawn. So we've got 3 squares to the right of the pawn, you've got 4 squares to the left. By escaping to the short side, it means that there's going to be more squares on the opposite side, and that is going to be used for your rook to give flanking checks. So we'll see how this looks here. It'll make more sense as we play through a few moves. So let's look at king c8 here. How should white try to make progress? Well, same as the last one, rook h8, right? We're going to force the king off, see if we can't get our king here, try to get a Lucina position. And the problem here is, let's say white plays king e6, then what can we do? How do we stop the pawn from moving forward? Right.
King c7.
King c7. So if the king ever moves away to the e file, then we're going to come into c7 and stop this pawn from pushing. And then if he checks us, we go back, and this looks exactly like it did before. White's going to have to try something else, right? So we come back over, and let's see what else white can try. So if white moves his king to the side, that's not going to work. Our king comes to c7 and stops the pawn. The other try white can do, the sneaky move, is rook to d8. So white's idea now is he wants to play a move like king to e6 or king to e7. That'll be defending his rook, and he'll be able to push his pawn later after he does that. So now what should we do for black? Done.
Maybe rook e1?
So rook e1 stops the king from coming out, but because you're not attacking the pawn anymore, white can play king to d7, and he's still going to make progress that way. This is where the whole idea of the short side comes into play. Why did we say we wanted to sneak our king out over here? Right.
Because there were more checks that our rook could do.
Right, and where is our rook going to give those checks from?
The e file to e file out. to the
So where should we put the rook to give those checks? What was it?
The h file.
The H file. So we're going to play rook to H1 here. And now the point is we're going to defend by checking on the side. Now that white put his rook in front of the king, he can't use the rook to defend the checks. So if he plays a move like, let's say, king to e7, we can just start checking the king. If the king moves away over here, let's see here. What should we do next? how can we stop the pawn from advancing and gain a little bit of time? Yeah,
King C7.
king c7. Attacking the rook, and now we're threatening to just move our king into d6. So if white runs his king toward our rook to get out of checks, we're going to be able to come over and eat the pawn. So that's not going to work very well for white. Already he's going to have to give up some squares here. And something like this isn't working because we're going to be able to check him and win his rook. So white can't run his king this way to get out of the checks. He's going to have to play a move like rook to e8. Now what do we do? Yeah. So rook h6 check. Let's say white plays rook e6. If rook h5, it looks like king d7 is going to make some progress.
Why aren't
Well, I guess not. The pawn's not defended.
Rook to h7.
Let's see. So rook e6. I think rook h5 looks okay.
Rook h7 loses because white plays
Oh,
rook e7 check.
Yeah, here, check, takes, and you're on the highway to the promised land.
Yeah.
So rook h5 here, king can't move up. And white's starting to run out of ideas here, right? All he could really do is try something like this. We'll check again. Happily repeat as much as we want. If he plays king to c5, then what can we do? Bobby.
We can just, sorry. Wait, oh, sorry, you're over here, never mind.
And you play king c7.
King c7.
And then it's almost the Philidor position.
And you might be able to get a Philidor, or you might just repeat the earlier positions that we saw again. Either way, you're still going to have the same sort of setup. So let's say he checks, you can go king d1. And of course, if he goes to the 7th, now we have our Philidor. And he can't push the pawn here. He could play king up, but once again, we're just repeating the same sort of positions that we already saw. What can we even, let's see, can we take the rook here for black? No.
No. You can't.
What wins for white if you take the rook? Which capture should he make?
D takes.
Both of them win.
Yeah, both of
Oh yeah,
them.
both of them win.
Both.
Because of the fifth rank rule?
No,
Yes, the king's in front of
king
the pawn.
squares.
But the pawn takes rook is faster.
If the way I remember is if the pawn is on the 5th rank, then if the king is in front of the pawn, it's an instant win. And so that's a win if you take with the king. If you take with the pawn, then white can push the pawn to the 7th rank without check, which means it's a forced promotion.
Cool. So we can't take the rook there, but what would we play instead?
Ryan's wiggling his fingers.
Yes.
So is it a rook h5, just went back where we came from?
Duh.
Rook h5, and he's going to go rook g6.
Rook to h8? Does that work?
C8.
This is still similar back to where we were, but what was our idea?
King f8.
Okay,
C8.
C8.
Oh my god, my board's set backwards. That's why.
Yeah, the board's backwards.
King comes over there.
Oh, do you have to repeat
And we're basically getting the same ideas as before. We've got our side flank checks. White comes here, we'll be able to check him. Our king can come back as well. So we've got all the same sort of defensive ideas going. So this is one to definitely set up, practice with, get used to the squares that hold. Try to figure out which moves lose, because those are the ones you want to avoid as well. Also, they're the ones that if you're on the white side, you want to eventually see if you can make your opponent make a mistake and see if you can happen to win the game, right? So this is a really good position to play around with and practice against a computer or with a friend. See if you can hold the draw or see if you can break the other guy's defense. Any questions about the idea of coming out to the short side here? Alrighty. So now we'll talk about a couple special cases. And knight pawns have a way of changing some of these rook endings pretty differently. So this is a game where we have black, we're trying to win the game. We've got a knight pawn, and white is trying to set up the short side defense. So like we just saw in the last example, white has put his rook behind the pawn, like he's supposed to do if he wants to escape to the short side. Is that going to work here? What should we play for black?
King B6.
Yeah, King G3. Sorry, the board keeps
Oh.
flipping around on you because
Oh,
sometimes
yeah,
we're
yeah.
white, sometimes we're black. But King G3. And the point here is the short side is too short. White's running out of ways. He can't run off the board to escape from the checks. So normally you want to go this way, but if you do that, what's going to happen here?
Checkmate.
Checkmate, right? So you can't escape to the short side. And now we're going to see why the long side doesn't work. So let's say white runs to the long side. We're going to play check. King comes out. And now what should we do for black? Another check isn't going to get us any closer because that would just repeat, right? If we play check, he'll go back here. And we've got the same position. James.
Rook to A4. Defend the pawn.
So rook to A4 would defend the pawn, but white will play his king back
Okay.
to F1 again.
What about rook to G1?
Rook to G1. And this was the idea we saw earlier that was a little bit tricky that we had to defend against with the side checks, right? So remember when we did the short side in the last example, when our opponent played rook to D1, we brought our rook out and were able to check the king from the side, right? Well, what happens if white tries that here? Does he have a place to put his rook to give us good flank checks?
No.
No, because the problem is the rook doesn't have space on the short side to give check, and if the rook goes to the same side as the king, then your own king gets in the way. So that's why your king belongs on the short side so that the rook can check on the long side. Because if your king goes to the long side, it's in the way of the rook, and it'll stop you from being able to hold the draw. So now black can just play a move like King G2, and you don't have any check from the side because your own king is in the way of your defense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, if you have a knight pawn, you don't have to worry about the other guy using the short side defense. That's a nice thing to know. That's not going to work against you. You can use this strategy to win. But, what if you're defending against the knight pawn? Is that still possible?
Bishop pawn. Wait, what?
Knight pawn.
Go to this one here. So black is getting ready to do the same thing that we saw before. Play rook A1, drive our king away, or King G6, rook A1 after we move. Use the same method that we just saw in order to win. Does white have any defensive idea here? Rook A1, he might play king G3 first, either way.
Rook to G8.
So if rook to
Seems
G8,
like
that's
it's
the position we just looked at. Black will play king to G3, and after king F1, we check, and he pushes. So rook to G8 doesn't work. That's the idea of the short side defense, right? But we don't have a short side, it's too short. We don't have enough to run away.
How do I lose? G3?
Tom.
Maybe rook F1?
Here the move is rook to F1, and this is the only case where what we call passive defense works. So passive defense means that our king is here in front of the pawn, and our rook is just going to dance back and forth on the first rank and never let black play a check. The only time this works is against a knight pawn. And the reason is that our king only has one square to go to, so the rook can't get outside of our king and check it from the other side. So because black isn't able to encircle our king from the other side, we're able to play this sort of passive maneuver. In the next one, we'll see how you defeat the passive defense if it's anything other than a knight pawn. So let's say that black plays G3 because, well, that's the only way to try to push forward, right? What should we do?
Just move a rook.
Just move rook anywhere except anywhere.
Anywhere on the first, right? So
Except A1.
C1's
No, like
fine.
rook A1.
Not A1. Anywhere but A1, or anywhere but up. And then we'll be okay. So we just dance our rook back and forth. Black has no good checks. He could try to check here. Then what do we do? King H1, right?
Very on our own king.
And if he checks, we just dance back and forth between H1 and G1 all day,
You're dancing.
and he never has a way to get forward.
And then if G2, then that doesn't work either.
So
Because
if
G2,
G2,
then you can play rook B3 check, and that actually.
and now white
That actually
wins.
wins.
Hooray! So if black tries too much to go for a win, he can actually manage to lose. So this is where knowing your endgames can be really helpful, especially in some blitz games or things like that, because you will occasionally be able to sort of swindle guys in these endings. If you know the defense and you're just sitting there dancing your rook back and forth, you might get a guy who has 2 seconds on his clock and says, sure, I'll try to win. And then you say, thank you for your rook, and I will win the game. So against the knight pawn, the passive defense works. But now we don't have a knight pawn. Now we've got a bishop pawn instead. And we want to win. And black, or white rather, is using passive defense. So he's dancing his rook on the first. He says, all right, show me that this doesn't work all the time. Why can't I always use passive defense?
Oh.
So what should black play to try to break through against this? Done.
F2 check.
F2 check is too soon. So if we play F2 check, I'm going to dance my king to F1.
Oh, wait, I gotta check before I can get my rook to the H1 square.
Yeah, because if you play rook H8, then he's got rook to B3 check, and he'll get your pawn. So F2 is too soon to be able to pull it off, unfortunately. Yes? Rook to A2. So this is the start of a maneuver that's going to be designed to force this king away from the pawn or away from where we'll be able to give a check behind him. So let's say white kills a move, plays rook C1. What should we do next?
Wait, what? Rook C1 just waits to checkmate in one. Rook C1? Oh no. You look, the arrow said rook to C4, and I'm like, wait, doesn't that just waste a mate in one?
He's just dancing. He's playing
I saw your arrow go to C4. I'm like,
Oh, yeah, I might have drawn the wrong arrow, or my mouse went over there. Yeah, Ryan.
So is it rook h2?
Rook h2 is the right idea, but it's not forcing.
You have no threats. Next thing you need
Well,
to-
there is a threat. What are you threatening?
Oh,
So
you
you're
have
like
threat
f2 and rook
You're
h2.
threatening
that,
F2.
but then you can just go to.
But black can stop it for
White.
now with rook to c3.
So then we can just go rook to a2. We go rook back, and then he has to move back to the first rank. So
Okay, so let's repeat it and then see if we can make progress from there again. So rook h2 doesn't break through for the win. It's the right idea though, but how can we set it up? Yeah,
G2.
rook to g2 first. So now the point is, if he plays king f1, what do we do?
Now we're rook to h2.
Now rook to h2. We're threatening the skewer. If he comes back, then
Now
what-
it's black's move.
now it's black's move, so we can play f2. And of course, we're gonna win the rook game here. So the only other try for white would be to play king to h1. Is that any better?
No.
This is rook to oh my god, rook 8.
Rook h2.
Same thing, right? Rook h2, king comes back, f2, and we get there just the same.
1, h1.
So that's what we call the encircling maneuver. We're going to move that rook down to the 7th. We're going to check the king to force it away. Check him again, and bring our rook back around with check. That's our idea of beating the passive defense.
That's good.
Again, it doesn't work against the knight pawn, because if these pieces are square over, then you don't have enough space for your rook to get around the king. So that's why passive defense works against a knight pawn, but
No.
nothing else.
Not the bishop pawn. King pawn.
Alrighty. Now, there's another defensive idea you can use if the opponent's pawn hasn't crossed the halfway point of the board yet. So in this position, one thing that black has that is really nice is this rook is stopping your king from getting in front of the pawn. That makes it really hard to defend because usually you want your king to be over here to be able to stop that pawn from queening. But if your opponent's pawn hasn't yet crossed the halfway point, there's another way that you can try to defend. You have a guess what that is? So pinning it doesn't quite work out because I can still move my king up. And then the pawn's ready to walk. And the king can't get closer, remember, because it's cut off by the rook.
Oh, you can just check on the first rank.
Check on the front. So this is the idea of frontal checks as a defense. Frontal checks. Normally this sounds wrong, right? Because we always learn we want our rooks behind the pawn, right? If we have a passed pawn, rooks belong behind that. This is one of the exceptions to those rules. If the enemy pawn is not past the halfway point, then you want to be in front of the pawn to give the checks. And the reason is that you have more space again. It's sort of the same idea as the short side, long side. You want that maximum checking distance from the enemy king. So let's say black's king moves up to c4. What should we do?
Rook c1 check.
One check.
No
Check him
c1.
again.
All right, king to b4.
Check him again.
All right. Let's say king a3 now.
Rook c1.
Okay, so we're attacking the pawn, and he defends it with the rook.
Rook to e4.
How do you play rook to
Not rook to
e4?
not the king to e4.
King to e4? Okay, there we go. And I'm gonna play check.
King to
King to
e5.
e5.
King to e5.
Oh,
Should
wait.
we go to
No,
e5?
No,
take
he's
it. Take the pawn.
No, you're in check.
He's
Oh,
gonna
yeah.
Should we go e5 or e3?
e3.
King to e3. So we want to make sure we're still closer to that queening square in case we need to come over there. We don't want to get locked out too far behind. And now let's say black tries king b4.
But what happens if you play king e5 though?
Probably king b4 as well.
Rook to B1 check.
Rook to B1 check.
Again. Check.
Rook B1. King to C4.
Rook C1 check.
Rook C1 check.
Why not?
I'll go hide over here. And this is that difference. If the king were on E5, then the king here could come to D3. And then if you checked, then you would have king to C2 attacking your rook, and this rook is defended by the pawn.
Well, but that would be a draw. You can trade rooks. And win.
Oh yeah, king's attacked. So
Maybe that's gonna give you-
C3. It might not be a difference, but it's more accurate to make sure your king is closer to the defense here. Not sure if black has a breakthrough or not, but it's safer for sure. All right, so the king went and hid on D5. Where are we going next? There's a few different ways to still hold the draw here. Lots of ways to use the same idea, but there's one that stops black's idea dead in its tracks. What does black want to play next?
F4? I don't know.
Black wants to play C4 next, right?
Oh.
So how could we force a draw if black were to play C4 next?
I think, I was thinking rook A1 after C4 or rook A5 and then we win the rook.
Okay, so rook A1, he's not going to play C4 then because he'll lose the rook.
Yeah.
But there's another way to sort of ask black to play C4 here and force a draw. Yeah.
Rook to the other side, H1.
Well, he's not going to choose to lose, so that's not going to work.
Yeah,
If you move your
I
rook
didn't-
away, he's not going to play C4. That's clear.
I just want to get him.
Why are you laughing so much?
Either of those will still work. They're all still drawish, but one nice thing you can play here is rook to C2. And the idea is after C4, how do we force a draw?
Rook to D2?
That works.
No.
Rook to D2 now.
But after king takes in king D4, isn't that an opposition?
No,
It's
the king has to
opposition,
be in front of the
but
pawn.
the king's not in front of the pawn.
Yeah.
So how do we win the opposition as white?
We can't win.
No.
Well, win the opposition.
Oh,
Draw
win.
the game.
King to C. King.
Like-
No, king to C1.
To C2.
Why do I say C1? C2, I
King
mean.
to C2, right? Because the
I-
black king can't go to C4, and so he can't maintain the opposition. And after he dances back, we can just dance all day. Normal king and pawn draws, right?
Maybe it would be worth looking at after that pawn, after the rook trade. So say king d4, king c2, c3. What should white do next?
Okay.
So I have, even though this is a draw, I have won this position as black because white didn't know what to do.
That's,
King C1.
King C1.
Why not king
Why?
d1?
Because black is
king
opposition.
D3, and then black is the opposition.
yep. So always in these positions, the way I like to remember it is keep your king in front of the pawn if you can. This is the easiest way to do it. Just retreat right in front of the pawn, and then when he goes to the side of the pawn, you can take the opposition.
But whatever you do, don't let him get his king in front of the pawn.
Right, and don't retreat on the diagonal. So if either one of these is going to lose here, only C1 will hold.
So move your king like it's a rook, but only move it like move it if it's a rook, then it can only go all the way to king. Only move it up and down and sideways.
No. Because basically you keep putting your king back and forth in front of the pawn until he comes around the pawn, and then you
Yeah,
put
you'll
your king
never
back
do
in front.
diagonal moves. You'll like almost never do diagonal.
Well, no, because he could play like king d4, king
Right,
c2, well, maybe that's right.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
that's another way of saying I think the same thing. But yeah, the way I like to think of it is just move your king between these two squares all day until black plays to one of these two, and then you move in front of them.
So never move your king diagonal.
Pretty much. You're never going to move them diagonal in that case. Yeah. So any questions on the idea of the frontal checking defense there?
I don't think so.
Cool. So that one we use if the pawn has not yet made it across the halfway point. That's when we use the frontal check idea. Alrighty, so that's most of the main theoretical endings that I have for you today. We're going to look at a couple other positions, have you evaluate them in order to sort of ingrain some of the stuff we went over. This one is sort of a fun position. It comes from a ready study. It's white to play and win in this position.
What?
Black is going this way down the board. So you have white. Your king's on the wrong side of the pawn to stop it, and black's trying to use his king and his pawn
Kidding, right?
to hold the draw.
You're kidding, right?
No.
White to play and win.
White's winning?
Yes.
I thought you meant black's winning. I'm like,
No, black's not winning. Black's trying to hold a draw.
sorry.
But it's not so easy because your king is shouldered out, right? He's stopping your king from being able to come and help. So rookie one is the most common try. That's kind of what we would think might work. Let's say black plays king f4. What's that? Rook f1, then king e3. Push the pawn. King e5, I attack your rook.
No. What about if you do king to e, king
Rook
to
to
e1?
war. I mean,
You're going to be one move too late here. King comes over.
Oh, wait, go back to where he attacked your rook.
Here?
Yeah, instead of king to e5, instead of king to e5, why not rook to e1?
To e1, I'll play my king over.
King comes down. Oh, just pawn pushes.
So,
Never mind.
In time.
That's tricky.
it's a very sneaky idea here.
Don't tell me. I'm gonna get it.
Why not rook to a4? Don't let the king come on the.
Rook to a4, then I just push my pawn. There's actually two winning moves for white here. They both have the same idea.
And both have a move by the same piece.
The only other reasonable moves that I see are rook e3 and rook e2, even though I don't know the idea.
So rook e3 and rook e2 are the other two reasonable moves. They are the ones that work.
Oh,
And
no.
what's the point here? Why is that?
Why not rook to
So the
e1?
point is when you play rook e1, eventually you're going to lose a tempo because the king is going to attack your rook. So king comes down, you need to bring your king into attack, right? Here comes the pawn, there goes the king, we're going to run after.
Oh, what's the difference between like,
Wait,
See,
I think
this
this
is
is
not
winning. This is winning.
This is
Yeah.
right. Oh, I don't move the king first, I push the pawn first. I got to shoulder your king out, my fault. Your king can't move forward. So now the point is you have to lose a move for white. Your rook is on e1, but your king can't move forward. So the only thing you can do with your rook is play it to either e2 or e3.
Oh, I see now.
So the point is that by playing the rook to e2 or e3 first, when black pushes the pawn, now you can play the rook to e1, and now it's the farthest away from the king. That's the idea, is that you have to basically, you want to play rook e1, but you're going to kill a move before playing it, because black is going to force you to get closer otherwise, and you want to be as far away as possible. So after rook e1, then the king comes down, and now you're going to be able to stop it.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes total sense.
Would have helped if I explained it right from the start with what black does, but. When you drop back, he wants to push the pawn. That's how black draws, not wins, but saves the draw. Questions on that one? So that's a fun, just sort of raw calculation study. Get you working on things a little bit. This next position, I don't remember if it actually happened in the game or if it was a variation that could have happened in a game between a Geary and a Ronian.
Bulgarian. Well, I thought this was the Lucina and Lucina.
It's close to a Lucina type position, and this sort of has to deal with if your opponent can achieve the Lucina position, what do you need to achieve to be able to hold a draw? So we have equal material here. Both sides have a pawn. Black's pawn is much, much closer to queen. He's 2 moves away, there's nothing in the way of it. White has a pawn. It's 4 moves away from queening, that's twice as far. And the rook is in front of the pawn, and generally we don't want rooks in front of pawns, right? We want them behind. So black is better here, right? Probably very close to winning the game. There's one move that white still has to draw though. And it has to do with once the Lucina position is achieved, where do we need our pawn to be in order to hold a draw if we have an extra pawn? How can we still allow the other guy to make a queen but draw nonetheless? That's the question here. So let's go ahead and think about that real quick. Imagine that black has his king on e1 and the pawn is on e2, right? Well, imagine that we're in that sort of setup, so it's close to a Lucina type position.
Wait, what?
We'll imagine that white's rook is on e8, and black forces the white king away. The king's on like b3, and black plays that bridge building move, right? He's got his rook on c5. So that would be a Lucina position, right? Now, when all of the trades happen, so the black king walks up, we give all the checks, he builds the bridge, eventually we're going to trade rooks on this e5 square, right? So black will play the move king takes e5, and then his pawn will be 1 square away from queening, and he'll make a queen. So if black plays king takes e5 with a pawn on e2, where does this pawn have to be in order for white to have a move to make a draw?
Is that h6?
It needs to be on h6, so that after king takes e5, white could play the move h7, and then after e1 queen, h8 queen, and both sides have a queen. So this position has to deal with understanding that. The way to counter the Lucina, or if your opponent is closer to achieving that, is you need to get your pawn to the 6th rank or further in order to hold the draw. If you can have your pawn on the 6th, then you'll be able to draw against the Lucina because you'll both be able to make a queen after you sack your rook, or trade your rooks rather. So what move can white make to guarantee that his pawn will get to the 6th in this position?
He has to make his rook, but where?
I think maybe h8 to try to get to e8.
Rook h8 is what happens in the game,
Ooh, yay!
and that loses.
What?
That is not the correct. Yep. Black is able to win in this game. So what happens here is the king comes up, white checks, and we end up in this Lucina looking position. After the rook comes over, there's a move that black gets to play to win the game. So keeping in mind what we said before, if white gets this pawn to the 6th, he wins. So what should black play?
Rook to a6.
Rook a6.
Or rook a5 here. same idea. But he plays rook a5 and stops the pawn from being able to come on.
Oh.
So black's able to stop the advance of that pawn. So rather than bringing the rook to h8, which is the most natural looking thing, it's what we all think to do because, well, we always want to create the longest checking distance, right? We always move our rooks furthest away from the king. Where should we put the rook instead?
We should keep our rook on the 5th rank, so we
Yeah,
can.
but where?
D5? Run the D5?
What square do we want this pawn to get to?
H6? H6.
h6, right? So how can we defend that square?
Rook to H7.
Never mind. That is good.
Rook to H7.
Remember, your rook's gonna end up on the E file.
Your rook won't stay on the h file forever. It's eventually going to have to move because of the Lucina type position. So which rank should we have the rook on when we do move it?
This the 5th, the 7th, the 7th, oh, the 6th. The 6th.
We're going to put it on h6.
Okay, what?
The idea is that now the rook will be able to defend from black being able to play rook to a6, so we'll be able to push our pawn. So for example, if the king comes up here, we're going to go ahead and check. And after the king comes over, rather than moving our rook first, we're going to play h5 first, guaranteeing that our rook is going to be able, or our pawn is going to be able to get to the 6th. Now there's nothing that the black rook can do to stop this pawn from getting to this square. Black's still going to be able to achieve his Lucina position, so he's able to go rook e, or king e1 here. We play h6, and he can play rook a7, stopping our pawn, but now he's going to be able to achieve that Lucina position that he wants. So king over, king comes, we've got that Lucina. Out come, oops, not out comes the king yet. What do we play for black? Where do we put the rook for the Lucina position?
The 5th rank?
Right. Okay.
And then H7? H7.
And h7 would work here. So that would stop this from working. If black comes out, we're going to be able to make a queen. So he really can't quite achieve what he needs in order to win this game. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Cool.
I knew this position was 2 rooks and multiple pawns was coming.
Finally, a multiple rook position, though it doesn't look like maybe they'll stay on the board for much longer. So here's a question, and this is just getting us thinking back in terms of, all right, we've got more pieces on the board. We've looked a whole lot at just finishing it off with the one pawn, all the different rook scenarios. But now we just have to get back to more pieces on the board in our endings. And I just want you guys to look at this position, white to move, and we're going through our candidate moves. I want you to evaluate the move rook takes g4. Tell me if that looks good, if that looks bad, if there's a better response for white to black's last move, which was g4.
I'm just gonna look at this. Wait, rook takes g4, right? Rook takes g4.
Yeah, so we're evaluating rook takes g4. I mean, look at other moves as well, but figure out if that move is better for us for white. Are we winning? Are we losing? Or is it equal? question, what other candidate moves do we have for white? Is there anything else that looks very good other than rook takes g4? Right?
F takes g4.
Okay, so you could consider f takes g4, and that really looks about it, because otherwise this rook is under attack, and if you retreat it, then you're just losing a pawn, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't look good, so really we're debating f takes g4 or rook takes g4. And why would one or the other be better?
I think rook captures g4 because now the white has control over an open g file and you can exploit that.
Yeah, so for starters, simply by taking with the rook, we're going to have that open file for our piece. So our rook's going to be a lot more active, that's going to help. What else is likely to happen here after rook takes g4?
Rook takes an f3.
Rook takes f3. Is rook takes f3 a good move for black?
I don't think so because the phone moves and white's rook is too active. The rook at g4 because you throw in check on this f3.
Right, so we're going to take, they're going to take, and like you said, we can check on the 7th. The king is going to be forced back. And look at all of these weak pawns. Black has way too many weak points in this position. White has a couple weaknesses as well, but they're more easily defended, and more importantly, white's potential passers are the h-pawn and the d-pawn. And once white wins one of these pawns, they're only going to be 3 squares away. Whereas black's potential passers, well, if his h-pawn becomes passed, it's going to be 5 squares away. And if he wins a pawn over here, they're going to be 4 squares away at the soonest, but he also has to win both pawns to clear the way because it's not going to be a pass pawn if he wins just one. So in terms of time, white is going to be able to create a pass pawn much faster than black is. So when we're evaluating these endgames, we want to look at activity, we want to look at weaknesses, but we also want to think in terms of time. When we create that passer, how long are we going to have to be able to make it into a queen or in order to defend against it? This is why a lot of times having advanced pawns in an endgame can be very deadly. If you can imagine this pawn here being on a7 and a white pawn on a6, then the game would practically be over, right?
It is over.
You would just take that pawn and this guy's going to queen really fast. So evaluating the pawns that get deep into our territory or that we're able to push deep into the enemy territory is also a really important thing to keep in mind in these endgames. So rook takes g4 is the right move, and this is a winning position for white already. Even though material is equal, with right technique, white is going to win here because his pawns are closer and he's able to attack the weaknesses faster. Any questions on that position?
No.
Alrighty. Okay. Here's a position where white is straight up down upon 3 versus 4, but he still has some drawing resources. It's not necessarily so easy for black. So how can we think about some of the things that we looked at earlier today, combine that with maybe some things we've looked at before? How can we try to hold a draw for white in this position?
White has to try like rook c2 check and rook d2, rook d3. But that seems kind of passive.
So you could try to hold that way, but it is a little bit passive. You actually have a more forcing way here, tactically, that is going to hold the draw on the spot in this position.
already say rook b2? Rook b2. What did it already say?
So anything on the second rank is going to be kind of passive. It's not going to be forcing enough to stop progress. Black's threatening things like d3, king b2, or king c3. He wants to keep moving up the board.
So
This move will stop black from being able
Rook to
to
e3.
make
Rook to a3.
rook to a3.
I said it first.
If rook to a3, black could still play d3.
Alright, fine.
Or black could check. There's a more forcing way.
Rook to a4 check? Oh, that
Rook
just,
to a4.
that kind of just forces the king down.
And the point is black doesn't have a way to improve this king without giving something up. So for example, if black plays king to c3, what should we do? Yeah,
Rook a3.
we're going to check him again. We're going to use that idea of checking on the side. And if he plays king to b4,
Rook to d3.
Rook to d3.
I said it first.
so you could play rook to d3, but then his king comes back, and really you want your king on this square rather than the rook. You can also just drop the rook back to a1. With the point that you're going to bring your king up over here. If his king goes back over here, you check him on the side again. If he pushes his pawn, then your king will blockade over here. And now you'll be able to check the king on the side or win the pawn. Either way, you're going to tie the king down to the defense of the pawn. Let's see how that can happen in another way. If black plays king d5, what should you do? Trying to run over this way. Yeah,
King d3.
king d3. Once we get this pawn fixed, then we'll be able to check the king away and re-attack the pawn. And black, anytime he puts two defenders on the pawn, will drive one away, and then we'll add a second attacker. So for example, let's say black plays king e5, we go check. He comes back, we attack the pawn. He's got to defend it, we play check. And we're going to have a repetition. Otherwise, we're going to be able to take the pawn.
Wait, can't we just do f4? No.
You know,
You're supposed to keep
I'm looking at, okay, what if the king comes over and attacks the rook?
So king b3 here.
Or I meant like, well, kind of the same thing, so say, I guess you could do it there too. So say, I guess king b3, and then, I don't know, rook a.
It's the same sort of idea as before. Rook a1 again, because again we're threatening to play king d3. And if you push it right away, then we step in front now. And it's going to be the same sort of setup. This rook is going to eventually tie your king to the defense of the pawn, and we're going to have two attackers on it. So you can't move the rook yet because it's defending. You got to play king c4. And now check. You come back, I repeat. If you go anywhere else, I attack your pawn, and you're stuck dancing back and forth. Though it's important that we evaluate the king and pawn ending here because we have to know that we can draw if we do make this trade. So let's say black plays king b4 and forces our hand. We have to know that we can draw this ending. This may be winning for us because our king's a little more active. So black doesn't want that, but maybe if his king were over on this side. We have to know we can draw whatever ending that we offer up to trade into. Does that make sense though? We want to set up the blockade with the king. So the idea is that initially we're trying to force this king away so that we can place our king in front of the pawn and then tie black to the defense. That's how you want to draw these positions where you're down the pawn. Blockade with the king and tie the other side down to defending. Any questions?
No.
All right. Last one today. We'll call it after this. This is just another nice position from a game that I played, but it's a little bit crazy. Pieces have traded off. We're in a rook and pawn ending, and this one is more of a race, right? White's got outside passers here, he's got passers here. Black has more pawns on the king side. It's black to move right now. Can black hold this? Is he losing because of white's passed pawns? Is he winning because his pawns are connected and white has more weaknesses? How should we evaluate this position?
Wait, it's black to move?
Black to move. White just played f takes e6.
I'm pretty sure this is great. Yes. I mean, first we should be like what the e3 is.
So the first big question is, should black prioritize this passed pawn or these connected passed pawns?
I think black should prioritize that pass pawn.
I think black should grab the pawn on h3 first. Because otherwise, I mean, that could be really dangerous.
So if we take this, can we still stop the e-pawn?
Yeah.
I think so, because no, you can't.
Why not?
Because if we take rook, we're gonna be 8. He can push one.
No, he was king f2.
King f2, then what should we do?
Then what will we do? Oh,
Wait.
King A8.
Isn't it rook a8?
Or
There's
king
better.
B8.
Much better.
No, you can play king g6.
King g6,
But
staying
what-
inside of
What
the square.
happened to rook? What about rook to b8? I mean, after before king to f2. What about rook to b8?
Rook to b8. Now I will probably go eat your
Oh,
e-pawn.
duh.
Tasty pawn, yum yum yum. And then you've got to dance back, and that didn't help very much. It was too
Yeah, it didn't
slow.
help at all. Help at all.
So the key here is that we do want to play rook takes a3. We need to evaluate that we can still stop the e-pawn, that there's no tactics against that. And the problem if we play rook to e3 first is that white is happy to give up this e-pawn and have these connected passers running up the board. These are going to be very strong. It's going to be much harder for my one rook to stop these two pawns and rook, especially because my king is over here. Whereas if we take the a3 pawn, we also know that our king is still capable of stopping this pawn. If we get the move king g6 in, or king g8, but king g6 is better because of tactics down here and you get kicked out of the square. If we play king g6, we can stay in the square, and when white ever pushes e7, we can play king to f7, and we're able to stop the queen of the pawn. So those are the things that we need to make sure we have in mind. And now suddenly look at how weak white's pawns are.
Yikes. No win for black.
Now, should black be able to win this position?
No.
Probably not.
No, white still has passers and a very outside passer. So here's what happened in the game. We'll look at it just for fun. White pushes the pawn, so I've got to stop it right away. Rook comes to b7, and now I'm going to move my king over. The other pawn comes over, and the problem for black is that after the move b6, I can't capture this pawn and be in the square of this pawn. So if I play rook takes e7, then white wins because after all the trades, b7 is too far away from my king. So I can't win this pawn outright, but I can still stop it from queening. If it ever queens, I'm still going to take it. And now I'll just move my rook behind the other pawn, and your rook is stuck. If your rook ever leaves the b file, I take this pawn, and if your rook ever leaves the 7th, I take this pawn. So basically, white is running out of moves. And black can make a bunch of pawn moves, but he still can't make any progress at the end of all of them. So white's trying to encircle, but he doesn't quite have time to do it. My king's close enough to defend my rook. We trade off a pair of pawns. I managed to win a pawn, but this is still a drawn ending with the 1 pawn deficit here. And that's our final position.
And
White's
you guys
able to
agreed
win
to
the
the draw?
pawn. We agreed to a draw.
Yeah, because your G3 pawn is definitely going down.
Yeah, I can't keep this G3 pawn alive. I tried to do some cheeky stuff down here and make a pass pawn, but well, it wasn't fast enough. We each had about 20 seconds on the clock after, I don't know, Rook B5, after we had the setup where we both ran out of moves. So we were just kind of blitzing off the rest from there.
Blitzing off.
All right, any questions before we wrap up today?
Nope.
Okay, those are Rook and Pawn endings. Hopefully you've enjoyed, and hopefully you can remember there's a lot of different specific positions to them. So be sure to review them and have some fun playing chess.
I'm hungry.